The viewport of the asterisk Meridian's Hope offered a view that Rowan Cross would have preferred not to have. Debris fields stretched across the approach vector to Voltoria Prime like a monument to stupidity. Twisted metal that had once been warships, now just expensive trash drifting in the void. Some of the larger pieces still bore identification markers. Rowan could make out the hull number of a Coalition dreadnought, half of it sheared away by what the briefing materials euphemistically called kinetic engagement. He wondered if the crews had known, in those final seconds, that they were dying over a dispute about resource rights and philosophical differences that probably could have been settled over drinks and a decent mediator. He wasn't that mediator. He was just the poor bastard who happened to be available when Ambassador Kelvin came down with Rigelian flu at the worst possible moment. Hayes appeared at his elbow, datapad clutched like a security blanket. His young face creased with the kind of worry that suggested he'd actually read all 1,500 pages of protocol documentation. "Sir, I've flagged the sections on Voltorian greeting customs. It's important that you don't." Hayes. Rowan turned from the viewport, offering what he hoped was a reassuring smile. "If I accidentally start a war by bowing wrong, I promise it'll be less destructive than the one they're already fighting." "That's not funny, sir." "It's a little funny." Rowan took the datapad anyway, scrolling through information he'd already memorized twice. The Voltorians had 73 documented greeting variations depending on status, relationship, and ceremonial context. Humans had handshakes and the occasional awkward hug. He'd always suspected humanity's diplomatic success in the wider galaxy owed less to wisdom and more to other species being exhausted by their own complexity. The ship's AI chimed softly. "Approaching Voltoria Prime orbital corridor. Estimated arrival at surface coordinates in 42 minutes. 42 minutes, until he stood between two groups of people who had spent a decade perfecting the art of killing each other. Rowan pulled up the brief on Queen Thessara, studying the image that accompanied her file. White hair bound in elaborate braids, pale skin that the xenobiologist said was an adaptation to Voltoria Prime's dense atmosphere, filtering certain wavelengths of light. Silver eyes that looked almost metallic in the photograph. And the ears, elongated, tapering to points, expressive in ways human ears could never be. The briefing materials included a whole section on reading Voltorian ear positions as emotional indicators, which Rowan had found both fascinating and mildly ridiculous. The Queen is described as uncompromising, Hayes read over his shoulder. Brilliant tactician, lost her entire family in the Corinth Station attack. Sir, that's the incident that... I know, Rowan closed the file. Everyone knew about Corinth Station. 15,000 civilians, gone in an attack that the Coalition claimed was targeting military assets and the sovereignty called genocide. The war had been brutal before Corinth. Afterward it had become something worse, personal, and somehow he was supposed to convince both sides that peace was possible. The shuttle bay was organized chaos when they arrived, crew members rushing to prepare for descent. Rowan caught sight of himself in a polished bulkhead, rumpled diplomatic uniform, dark hair that refused to cooperate with any amount of product. The face of a man who looked like he'd be more comfortable teaching history than making it. He joined the diplomatic corps because he was good at listening, good at finding common ground, good at making tense people laugh at exactly the right moment to defuse whatever bomb was ticking in the room. Trade disputes, border negotiations, that memorable incident with the Andromedian ambassador and the ceremonial fish, those were his wheelhouse. This was so far outside his wheelhouse that he couldn't even see the wheelhouse from here. "Sir." Hayes was holding out a small case. "Your translation implant needs updating with the latest Voltorian dialect variations." Rowan took it, pressing the device against his temple and wincing at the familiar sting of neural interface. Information flooded in, linguistic patterns, cultural context, about 600 ways to accidentally insult someone's lineage. You know what I love about this job? The constant reminder that humans are one linguistic misunderstanding away from disaster. That's why protocol exists, sir. Hayes, protocol is what people invented to make themselves feel better about the fact that we're all just making this up as we go. Rowan handed back the case. How old are you? 24, sir. You're going to give yourself an ulcer. When this is over, remind me to buy you a drink and teach you the art of productive pessimism. The shuttle shuddered slightly as it detached, beginning its descent toward the planet below. Through the viewport, Voltoria Prime resolved from abstraction into reality, continents wrapped in white clouds, oceans that reflected the system's binary stars in shades of amber and gold. Beautiful. The briefing materials said the planet had been beautiful before the war too, covered in cities that blended biotechnology and architecture in ways that made human urban planning look primitive. Now whole regions were dark, their power grids destroyed, their populations scattered. Rowan watched a burnt-out orbital platform drift past, its skeletal structure a reminder of escalation. Someone had built that. Someone had destroyed it, and now someone, him apparently, was supposed to convince everyone that building was better than destroying. Approaching conference site, the pilot announced. Landing in 8 minutes. Hayes was reviewing his datapad again, lips moving silently as he memorized something. Rowan envied him that focus. His own mind kept wandering to the weight of what came next, walking into a room full of people who had buried friends, family, futures. People who had very good reasons to hate each other, and only the thinnest motivation to listen to a human tell them about peace. The shuttle descended through atmosphere, buffeted by winds that made Hayes grip his seat. Rowan kept his eyes on the approaching surface. The conference site was neutral territory, a facility built specifically for these talks, all smooth architecture designed to offend no one. He could see it now, a circular structure that looked like someone had tried to make a building out of mist and geometry. Sir. Hayes looked up from his datapad, face pale. What if they don't listen? Rowan considered the question seriously. Then we're watching the preview of how this sector ends. But Hayes, people don't agree to peace talks unless some part of them wants to stop fighting. Our job is to find that part, and make it louder than the part that wants revenge. And if we can't, then at least we'll have tried. The shuttle touched down with barely a tremor. And I'll have one hell of a story for why I should go back to mediating trade disputes. The ramp descended, and Rowan stepped out into air that tasted of ozone and something floral he couldn't identify. The conference facility loomed ahead, its entrance flanked by security from both sides, sovereignty guards in their dark ceremonial armor, coalition forces in lighter tactical gear. All of them armed, all of them watching. Hayes fell into step beside him, clutching his datapad like it might protect him from the tension radiating off everyone present. Ready, sir. Rowan thought about everything that had led to this moment. A decade of war, thousands of dead, a failed senior ambassador, and a mid-level diplomat who was better at jokes than gravitas. He thought about Queen Thessara waiting inside, about the coalition representatives who would be looking for any excuse to walk away, about the impossible task of turning hatred into handshakes. Not even a little bit, he said, and walked through the doors into history. The conference chamber managed to be both impressive and utterly soulless, which Rowan supposed was exactly what neutral architecture aimed for. Curved walls in some shade between gray and beige, lighting that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, chairs arranged in concentric circles like someone had tried to geometrically enforce equality. He'd been in warmer morgues. Representatives from both factions filled the space with the kind of silence that had weight. Rowan could feel eyes on him as he made his way to the central speaking platform, Hayes trailing behind like a nervous shadow. The sovereignty delegation occupied the left side, their dark uniforms creating a visual wall of unity. And at their center sat Queen Thessara. The photographs hadn't done her justice, which Rowan found mildly irritating since he'd spent 3 hours studying them. Her white hair was bound in braids so intricate they must have taken hours, woven through with what looked like silver thread. Her skin had that luminous quality the briefing materials mentioned, pale enough that the faint tracery of veins at her temples was visible. The ceremonial robes she wore were dark as midnight, embroidered with patterns that probably meant something significant that Rowan hadn't had time to memorize. But it was the ears that struck him, elongated and tapering, currently held in what his crash course in Voltorian body language suggested was attentive formality. And those eyes, silver and wide, watching him with an intensity that made him want to check if he'd forgotten to put on pants. Across from the sovereignty delegation, the coalition representatives looked equally uncomfortable. Their leader, a scarred veteran named Kalrath according to the files, had his hand resting casually near a weapon that protocol said shouldn't be in the room. Everyone had weapons that shouldn't be in the room. Rowan had counted at least 6 violations of the agreed-upon security terms before he'd even reached the platform. He activated the holographic display, and the diplomatic core seal materialized above him in soft blue light. "Your Majesty, honored representatives, I'm Rowan Cross, here on behalf of the Terran Diplomatic Corps to facilitate." His voice felt wrong in the space, too casual somehow, though he was following the script exactly. Hayes had made him practice the pronunciation of every title 17 times on the shuttle. Rowan continued, falling into the rhythm of diplomatic language that managed to use many words to say very little. Mutual interests that transcend current hostilities. The cost of continued conflict, measured in both material resources and... He'd reached the part about the devastating economic impact, was maybe 30 seconds into his carefully crafted opening statement, when he noticed Queen Thessara had stopped breathing. Not metaphorically, actually stopped. Her chest was motionless, her silver eyes locked on him with an expression that looked like she'd been struck. Those expressive ears, which had been held in diplomatic attention, shifted backward in what might have been shock or alarm or something the briefing materials hadn't covered. Rowan stumbled over the word reconciliation, caught by the sudden shift in the room's energy. Thessara's advisors were leaning toward her, their own ears tilting in concern. One of them, an older Voltorian with scars crossing his face, placed a hand on her arm and was ignored completely. The coalition representatives had noticed too. Kalrath's hand moved closer to his weapon, his posture shifting from bored tolerance to alert suspicion. Whatever was happening with the Queen, it was derailing the careful neutrality everyone had pretended to agree to. Rowan tried to continue. The framework we're proposing addresses concerns regarding. Thessara's hand rose, cutting him off mid-sentence. The gesture was sharp enough that the entire chamber fell silent. When she spoke, her voice carried a tremor that seemed to shock her own delegation as much as it surprised Rowan. "Your voice." 2 words. They landed in the silence like stones in still water, ripples spreading in directions Rowan couldn't track. He stood frozen on the platform, the holographic display still showing economic projections that suddenly seemed absurd. "Your Majesty." He kept his tone carefully neutral, trying to project calm, while his mind raced through every possible explanation for this reaction. Had he mispronounced something catastrophically? Was his translator implant malfunctioning, turning his speech about peace into a recitation of Voltorian curses? Thessara was gripping the arms of her chair, knuckles pale against the dark wood. Her ears had flattened completely against her head in what Rowan's hastily acquired knowledge suggested was either extreme distress or intense focus. When she looked at him again, there was something almost desperate in her expression. "I know your voice." The scarred advisor tried again to speak to her, but Thessara shook her head sharply. She stood, the movement fluid despite the obvious tension in her frame. Every eye in the room tracked her as she moved forward, stopping a few meters from the platform where Rowan stood trying to remember how breathing worked. "Your Majesty, if I've caused offense," he began, falling back on diplomatic training that felt wholly inadequate for whatever this situation was. Clear the room. Thessara's voice was stronger now, though still carrying that underlying tremor. She wasn't looking at her advisors or at the coalition representatives who were exchanging glances that suggested they thought this might be some elaborate power play. She was looking at Rowan like he was a puzzle she couldn't solve and desperately needed to. The chamber erupted in protest. The scarred advisor was speaking rapidly in Voltorian, his ears signaling something urgent. Kalrath was on his feet, arguing that clearing the room violated the agreed-upon terms. Hayes had appeared at Rowan's elbow, datapad clutched uselessly, radiating panic. Thessara raised her voice over the chaos, and Rowan heard the authority that had led armies. "I said clear the room, now." It wasn't a request. The tone made that clear. Her own advisors moved first, reluctance evident in every step. The coalition representatives took longer, Kalrath arguing, until one of his subordinates physically tugged him toward the exit. Hayes looked at Rowan with an expression that suggested he'd rather face the vacuum of space than leave his superior alone with an alien queen who was acting inexplicably. "It's fine," Rowan said with more confidence than he felt. "Wait outside." "Sir, protocol states." Hayes outside. The young officer left, glancing back 3 times as if Rowan might vanish if he looked away. The massive doors sealed with a hiss that sounded far too final. And then it was just Rowan standing on a platform meant for speeches he wasn't giving, and Queen Thessara standing a few meters away, trembling slightly despite obvious efforts to control it. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft hum of environmental systems. Rowan watched her struggle with something internal, watched her ears shift through positions that probably telegraphed her emotional state to anyone who could read them properly. He wished he'd had more than 3 hours to study Voltorian body language. "Your Majesty," he tried again, keeping his voice gentle. "I don't understand what's happening here." Thessara's laugh was sharp and humorless. "That makes 2 of us." She moved closer and Rowan fought the urge to step back. Up close, he could see the fine lines around her eyes, the signs of stress that transcended species. "Where do I know your voice from?" It was almost a demand, almost a plea. Rowan searched his memory frantically. He'd never been to Voltoria Prime before this mission. His previous assignments had been trade negotiations, border disputes, that incident with the ceremonial fish. Nothing that would have brought him into contact with the queen of the sovereignty faction. "I've never met you," he said honestly. "This is my first time in this sector." "Not met." Thessara shook her head, frustrated. "But I know your voice. I've heard it before. She stopped, hands clenching and unclenching at her sides. "This is absurd. I don't recognize people by voice, and yet I know I've heard you speak." Rowan's translator implant chimed softly, a reminder that it was working properly. So it wasn't a malfunction turning his words into something else. He tried to think of any long-distance communications, any recordings, anything that might have crossed paths with the Queen of the Sovereignty. Maybe a diplomatic broadcast, he offered, though he knew it was weak. "I've done some communications work, nothing major, but—" No, Thessara was certain. This was personal. She stopped again, and for a moment she looked lost in a way that seemed completely at odds with every briefing file description of the uncompromising military leader. "I was speaking with someone." "Someone who?" She cut herself off, turning away from him. Her ears had shifted again, and Rowan wished desperately that he understood what they were telling him. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, almost wondering. 4 years ago, in the middle of the night, I was about to make a decision that would have, she paused, gathering herself. Someone contacted me, someone who shouldn't have been able to access that channel. Someone who talked to me for 3 hours like they understood exactly what I was facing. The memory hit Rowan like cold water, sudden and complete. 3 in the morning, monitoring station duty, watching intercepts he shouldn't have been watching. A transmission he'd tracked, encrypted but not encrypted enough. and a decision to do something phenomenally stupid that his superiors had buried so deep he'd convinced himself it never happened. His face must have shown something because Thesara spun back to face him, and now there was certainty in her expression. It was you. Rowan's throat had gone dry. He watched Queen Thesara stare at him like she was seeing a ghost materialize in real time, and part of him wanted to deny it. The smart thing would be to deny it. That night had been classified 6 ways to Sunday, buried under so many security protocols that he'd half convinced himself it was a fever dream brought on by too many double shifts. But apparently the Queen of the Sovereignty remembered it perfectly. "I spent 3 months expecting to be court-martialed," he said finally, because there didn't seem to be any point in lying to someone who was looking at him like that. "My commanding officer pulled me into his office, and I was so sure I was done. Instead, he told me the incident never happened. I was never on duty that night, and if I ever mentioned it again, I'd be filing environmental reports on a mining station for the rest of my career." Thesara made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "I spent 3 months trying to find out who you were. I pulled every favor I had, accessed records I shouldn't have been able to access. Everything led to classified dead ends." She was pacing now, agitation clear in every movement. "Do you have any idea what it's like to have a conversation that changes everything, and then have that person vanish like they never existed?" In my defense, vanishing wasn't my idea. Rowan stepped down from the platform, suddenly tired of standing above her. "I was a communications officer, night rotation, monitoring encrypted channels for security threats. When I caught that transmission, your transmission, I should have logged it and moved on. But you didn't." "No, the memory was crystal clear now, all the details flooding back. You were talking to yourself, or I thought you were. Later I realized you were recording a message, maybe for posterity or justification or, I don't know. But you were describing this weapon, this bioweapon that would target coalition genetic markers. You said it would end the war in 72 hours. Thesara had stopped pacing. Her ears were flat against her head again and her voice was barely above a whisper. "The Corinth Protocol, that's what we called it, after the station. After my family died there, along with 15,000 others. You were going to deploy it." Rowan kept his voice neutral, non-judgmental. He'd made that same choice 4 years ago in the moment, and he made it again now. "You had authorization, you had means, you had every reason in the universe to want revenge. And you contacted me." There was something raw in her expression now, like old wounds being examined in harsh light. "On a channel that should have been impossible for a human to access. You didn't threaten me. You didn't try to bargain. You just talked." Rowan laughed, the sound bitter even to his own ears. "I had no idea what I was doing. I'd been awake for 16 hours. I was running on bad coffee and worse judgment. And I was watching someone about to cross a line that you don't come back from. So I did the stupidest thing possible and opened a channel." "What did you say?" Thesara moved closer, and there was intensity in her silver eyes that made Rowan want to look away. "I remember your voice. I remember the feeling of that conversation, but the specific words. I asked if you'd thought about what happened after." The memory was so vivid he could almost feel the cramped monitoring station around him again, could taste the stale, recycled air. "You had this weapon that would win the war, end the coalition, give you everything you'd been fighting for. And I asked what you'd do on day 73. I told you I'd rebuild." Thesara's voice was distant now, lost in the same memory. "I'd create something better from the ashes. And I asked if you could rebuild yourself." Rowan met her eyes, remembering the awful silence that had followed that question. Because using that weapon would kill millions of people who had nothing to do with Corinth Station. Children, civilians, people who didn't choose this war any more than your family chose to die in it. And I asked if you could live with being the person who did that. The silence stretched between them, heavy with 4 years of weight. Thesara's hands were shaking slightly, and she seemed to notice because she clasped them together tightly. You made me articulate it, she said finally. Every justification I had, you made me say it out loud. And when I heard my own voice explaining why it was acceptable to commit genocide for revenge, I sounded like someone who'd lost themselves, Rowan finished quietly. You said that. At hour 2, when you were crying and I was terrified I'd made everything worse. You said you didn't recognize yourself anymore. I wanted you to tell me it was okay. Thesara's voice broke slightly. I wanted permission from someone, anyone, to do what every part of me was screaming to do. And you wouldn't give it to me. I couldn't. Rowan remembered his own hands shaking as he'd kept that channel open, knowing he was risking everything for a stranger who might deploy the weapon anyway. But I also wouldn't judge you for whatever choice you made. I just wanted you to choose consciously, not from grief or rage or exhaustion. 3 hours, Thesara said, and now she was the one who laughed, though it sounded painful. We talked for 3 hours. You told me about your sister who died in a transport accident when you were 15. I told you about watching the censored data from Corinth, knowing my family was on that station, and being too far away to do anything but watch the numbers drop to 0. You said revenge wouldn't bring them back, but at least it would mean something. Rowan felt the words pulling out of him, things he'd buried for 4 years. And I said maybe meaning wasn't worth millions of lives. And you called me naive. You were naive. But there was no heat in it, just a kind of exhausted fondness. You were this human communications officer who had no business getting involved, breaking probably 50 regulations, risking your career to talk to someone you'd never met about choices you couldn't understand. But I understood enough. Rowan thought about that night, about the choice to keep talking when every rational part of his brain screamed to log off and report it properly. I understood what it feels like to want the pain to mean something, to want revenge to fill the hole that loss creates. Did you? Thesara's eyes were sharp now, searching, because you talked about your sister like you'd made peace with it. I lied. The admission came easier than expected. I hadn't made peace with anything. But I knew that if I was talking to you about revenge and meaning and the cost of becoming a monster, I couldn't be a hypocrite about it. So I told you what I wished I believed, and maybe somewhere in saying it, I started to. Thesara stared at him for a long moment, then did something completely unexpected. She laughed. Really laughed, the sound echoing off the chamber's neutral walls. You were lying. This entire time I've been carrying around your words like some kind of sacred wisdom, and you were just making it up as you went. Pretty much, Rowan admitted, and felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. I figured if I was going to be court-martialed anyway, I might as well commit to the bit. Unbelievable. But Thesara was smiling now, and it transformed her face into something younger, less weighted. The voice that's been my conscience for 4 years belongs to a communications officer who was winging it on bad coffee. But to be fair, it was really bad coffee. Rowan found himself smiling back. The monitoring station recycler made something that was technically classified as a beverage but probably violated several health codes. But I didn't deploy it, Thesara said suddenly, the humor fading back into something serious. The Corinth Protocol, after we talked, after you signed off with some platitude about hoping I found peace. I panicked at the ending, Rowan interrupted. I didn't know how to say goodbye to someone. I just talked out of genocide. After that terrible goodbye, Thesara continued, I sat in my command center for another hour. I had my hand on the authorization codes, and I kept hearing your voice asking what happened on day 73. So I archived the weapon instead. I know. At her surprised look, Rowan explained. I monitored the channels for 2 weeks afterward, terrified I'd see reports of mass coalition casualties. When nothing happened, I thought maybe you just delayed it. Took me months to accept that you'd actually chosen not to deploy. I chose not to become what that weapon would have made me. Thesara's voice was steady now, certain. And I've spent 4 years trying to be worthy of that choice. Every negotiation, every decision about the war, I'd think about that night. about the anonymous human who cared enough to risk everything to talk to a stranger. And now that stranger is standing in your conference chamber, sent to mediate peace talks. Rowan shook his head at the absurdity. The universe has a terrible sense of humor. Or a perfect one. Thessara moved closer, and Rowan saw the weight she carried in the lines around her eyes, the tension in her shoulders. Do you know how many times I've wondered what you looked like? If you were young or old, experienced or foolish, someone important or just someone who made an impossible choice in a moment. Definitely foolish, Rowan said. The jury's still out on the rest. You're here. There was wonder in her voice, almost childlike. The voice that saved me from myself has a face, has a name, has walked into my life again at exactly the moment when. She stopped, and Rowan watched her process something. When she spoke again, there was steel beneath the wonder. They sent you to negotiate peace. The universe or fate or bureaucratic accident put the one person I've spent 4 years remembering in front of me to finish what you started. The negotiations resumed 3 hours later, and everyone pretended the private meeting hadn't changed anything fundamental. But Rowan could feel the shift in the room's energy. Thessara's advisors watching him with new curiosity. Coalition representatives noting how the Queen's posture had relaxed incrementally. Hayes practically vibrating with questions he wouldn't ask until they were safely off-planet. The talks progressed with momentum that surprised everyone except possibly Thessara. When coalition representatives raised concerns about territorial boundaries, she proposed compromises that her own advisors clearly hadn't expected. When discussions stalled over reparations, she turned to Rowan and asked for human perspective on post-conflict reconstruction, and something in her tone made it clear this wasn't just diplomatic courtesy. Kalrath noticed. During a break on the second day, the scarred coalition leader cornered Rowan near the beverage dispensers that served liquids neither faction found particularly palatable. The Queen trusts you. It wasn't a question. Kalrath's hand rested near his weapon out of habit, but his ears, less expressive than Thessara's but still readable, signaled curiosity rather than threat. That's unusual. She doesn't trust easily. Rowan selected something that claimed to be tea and almost certainly wasn't. Maybe she's tired of fighting. We're all tired of fighting. Kalrath's laugh was bitter, but tired doesn't mean trusting a human mediator who appeared 3 days ago. Then maybe she sees something in these talks worth risking trust for. Rowan met the coalition leader's eyes. Or maybe she's just better at politics than either of us. He walked away before Kalrath could push further, carrying terrible tea back to a conference chamber where people were actually discussing demilitarization timelines instead of arguing about who started what. Small miracles, built on a foundation of a conversation 4 years old that nobody else knew had happened. That night, Thessara requested another private meeting. Hayes looked like he wanted to object, but Rowan waved him off and followed the Queen to a balcony overlooking the neutral zone. 2 moons hung in the sky, casting silver light across architecture designed to belong nowhere. Your coalition counterpart thinks I'm being manipulated, Thessara said without preamble. She was holding a glass of something that glowed faintly blue, indigenous wine, that the briefing materials warned was mildly toxic to humans. My own advisors think I've gone soft. Have you? Rowan kept his tone light, leaning against the railing. I've gotten practical. She took a sip of the glowing wine. 4 years ago, you asked me what I'd do on day 73 if I won the war through genocide. I didn't have an answer then. I have one now. Which is? That winning through atrocity means spending every day after wondering if the cost was worth it. And eventually, the answer is always no. She turned to face him, moonlight catching in her silver eyes. These peace talks, they're my day 73. What comes after all the fighting stops? Rowan nodded slowly. That's why you're actually negotiating instead of posturing. That's why I need you here. Thessara's voice dropped. Not because you're a brilliant mediator or because the diplomatic corps sent you, Because you're the person who saw me at my worst and didn't turn away. When I look at you, I remember that I'm capable of choosing something better. That's a lot of weight to put on a communications officer who made one unauthorized call 4 years ago. You spent 3 hours talking a stranger out of becoming a war criminal. She smiled slightly. I think you can handle it. The days blurred together after that, technical discussions about ceasefire zones, heated arguments over prisoner exchanges, endless minutiae about trade routes and resource allocations. But beneath it all, progress. Real progress. The kind that made Hayes stop looking like he expected explosions every 5 minutes and start looking like he believed peace might actually be possible. On the 7th day, someone tried to kill Rowan. The attack came during a recess, crude but nearly effective, an explosive device planted in his private quarters, timed to detonate when he returned to review notes. Hayes found it by accident, dropping a datapad that rolled under the desk where the device waited. The young officer's panicked shout brought security running, and Rowan spent 20 minutes being scanned for additional threats while trying to process that someone wanted him dead badly enough to violate the neutral zone's sacred protocols. Thessara's reaction was volcanic. She deployed her personal guard to protect the human delegation before anyone could argue protocol, snapped orders in rapid Volturian that had her advisors scrambling, and demanded immediate investigation that her coalition counterparts couldn't refuse without looking complicit. Rowan, bandaged from being tackled by overzealous security and harboring new respect for how much concrete floors hurt, found her in the medical facility an hour later. She was arguing with a doctor about access, her ears flat against her head in fury that seemed barely contained. "I'm fine," he said from the doorway. Bruised ego and a scraped elbow. The explosive wasn't that sophisticated. Thessara spun toward him, and the relief that flooded her expression was unmistakable. "You could have died." "But I didn't." He moved into the room, waving off the doctor's protests. Someone panicked. Probably hardliners on one side or both who see these talks actually working and hate it. That makes it acceptable. Her voice was sharp. Someone tried to kill you because you're doing your job too well and you're joking about it. Would you prefer I panic? Rowan sat on the examination table, suddenly aware of how tired he was. Thessara, we both knew this was dangerous. Peace is threatening to people invested in war. When I heard, she stopped, composing herself with visible effort. When they told me there had been an attack, that you were injured, I heard your voice. That voice from 4 years ago, patient and steady and convincing me not to destroy myself. And I thought about never hearing it again. The vulnerability in that admission silenced whatever flippant response Rowan had prepared. He looked at this woman who led armies and negotiated empires, seeing the person who'd been terrified and grieving and making impossible choices in the dark. "I'm still here," he said quietly, "still talking. Still convinced that people choosing something better is worth whatever risk that takes." "You're an idiot. It's been mentioned." He smiled slightly. "But I'm an idiot who's watching you build peace instead of war. That seems worth a few explosives." The investigation revealed hardliners in Thessara's own faction, officers who'd lost too much to accept any ending except total victory. Their arrest sent shockwaves through the negotiations, nearly derailing everything until Thessara stood before both delegations and said that anyone committed to continued war over her people's future could leave now. No one left. The treaty they eventually signed wasn't perfect. Coalition representatives complained about territorial concessions. Sovereignty advisors argued the reparations timeline was too generous. Everyone found something to hate about the demilitarization protocols. But they signed it, all of them, in a ceremony that the galactic media covered like the historical moment it was. Rowan stood beside Thessara during the signing, officially present as the mediator who'd facilitated the agreement. Only the two of them knew the real timeline, that this peace had started 4 years ago with an unauthorized call, had been built on a foundation of a voice in the dark talking someone back from an edge, and was being completed now by putting a face and name to that memory. Afterward, in a quiet moment while everyone else celebrated or argued about implementation details, Thesara found him on the same balcony where they'd talked under the moons. "You're leaving tomorrow," she said. It wasn't a question. "Diplomatic Corps wants me to brief on the negotiations. Apparently successfully mediating peace looks good on performance reviews." He kept his tone light, though something in his chest felt tight. "Hayes is already composing his report. I think it's currently 17,000 words. Will you tell them," she gestured between them, "about 4 years ago? That's classified 6 ways to Sunday, remember." Rowan smiled. "But even if it wasn't, some things matter more as private history than public record." Thesara nodded slowly. "I spent 4 years hearing your voice in my head, using it as a compass when my own judgment felt compromised. And now I have to figure out how to navigate without that." "You never needed my voice," Rowan said honestly. "You needed a reminder that you were capable of choosing mercy. That's not about me. That's about who you are under all the war and loss and responsibility. The person I am chose not to deploy the Corinth Protocol, because a human stranger spent 3 hours on terrible coffee, convincing me I could be something better." She turned to face him fully. "That matters. You matter, not just as a mediator or a voice from memory, but as proof that sometimes the most important choices happen in moments nobody else sees." "Like 3 in the morning on a monitoring station," Rowan agreed. "Or right now, choosing to build instead of destroy even when destruction would be easier." They stood in comfortable silence, watching lights in the neutral zone gradually illuminate as night fell. Somewhere below, Hayes was probably panicking about departure logistics. Somewhere in the galaxy, news feeds were analyzing the treaty's implications. And somewhere in both their memories, a conversation 4 years old connected past salvation to present possibility. "Thank you," Thesara said finally, "for the call you shouldn't have made, for the peace you helped build, for recognizing that my voice meant you mattered enough to finish this." Rowan looked at her. This woman who'd almost destroyed millions and instead chose to create peace, who'd carried his words like sacred trust and used them to become someone worthy of that night's choice. "Thank you for not hanging up." She laughed, the sound carrying across empty space. "We're both idiots." "Probably," Rowan agreed. "But we're idiots who helped end a war. That's got to count for something."